so he's in Minnesota.
All right. Yeah, go ahead. We're live. I think that's currently unmuted. I think people can hear us. We'll be starting in just a second. I hope. Yeah. Okay. We're projecting audio. Okay. Yeah.
It sounded like there was an echo.
Yeah, because I unmuted.
Okay. Right. Obviously.
So test. Well, actually, if we're live, I can just test it right
Says
now.
10 watching, 11.
Hey. Nice. Great. Let me go to the control room here.
Well, since we had such a small audience, I don't know if I want to wait for Adrian and Daniel. Does that mean there'll be more music today?
Hi everyone. Oh, hi everyone who's listening in live. I'll be with you in a second. I'm just going to mute myself. Okay. Hi everyone. I guess we're just going to get started here, kinks and all, warts and all. I want to thank all of you to our inauguration of the first in a class series that we are starting, which is going to have a heavy emphasis and focus on what do you actually need to do to rebuild the country and stop us from plunging into World War III. I see there's 183 people on right now, which is crazy. Part of it is, anyway, that's awkward.
Yeah, I was supposed to check it out.
Can I tell it to not move anymore?
Don't touch it.
It flips on its own.
Oh. As you can see, we're still working out the kinks on this. And yeah, I don't know. We'll just if you go upside down during the stream, I think it's fine. I think people will understand it's our first stream that we're doing this, and okay, we're gonna keep putting up the gimbal. Just gonna do that. We'll be back.
Gonna fall anymore.
All right, we're gonna pretend like we're just starting over from the beginning here. I'm horizontal. That's okay? That's okay? Then I'm vertical?
Looks good.
Yeah?
Makes you look tall.
You can just flip it, and if that big a deal.
All right.
You look very tall.
Quite a way to start a class series. We're a serious campaign here, by the way. All right. So I'm still working out the kinks. This is obviously the first class. I've said this 3 times now, and I know we're doing things kind of loosey-goosey as we go, informal. We don't really have all the technical stuff down, as you can see, but the situation kind of demands that we figure this out. To cast a more serious light on what's actually going on, people saw that the leader of Hamas was killed by the Israelis, and now Iran has promised revenge. And so it looks like we are going to go to war with Iran. And worst of all is that last night, Joe Biden declared his undying love and support for Netanyahu, saying that we're going to back Netanyahu no matter what happens. We are just going to defend Israel with everything we got. So we're screwed, pretty much, unless people actually act and do something. But what is that something? It's not difficult to talk about the problem. It's not difficult to talk about what's wrong with the world. Everybody knows what's wrong with the world. Your uncle knows what's wrong with the world. The electrician down the street knows what's wrong with the world. But the question is, what do you actually do to fix it? And what does it actually take to fix it? And what has happened in our history, in our country, that has allowed us to create a nation that was then subverted and destroyed? That's what we actually need to address. Because if we're not able to understand the principles that compose this country when it was first founded and developed, then we cannot understand how to actually fix the problem. In today's world, we're faced with a lot of nominalism. What do I mean by that? We like to say the problem is capitalism. And we label it and we put it away and we say that's the big boogeyman. And everybody has 20 different definitions of what they mean when you say capitalism. Everyone likes to say that the problem is fascism or tyranny or dictatorship. Now those things may be true, but do people still really understand what that actually means? I happen to believe that a lot of the evils of the world go back to Aristotle and the idea that mankind is an animal. And if you actually believe that man is an animal, then you would run your government that way, believing that people are no different than animals and that some people deserve to be on top of other people, societally, in the hierarchy. Whereas the opposing view, the real view, is that mankind is not an animal, but actually a divine creature with mortal body, but a divine mind. If you believe that, but if you actually know that, to know that mankind is not an animal, then you understand the fight of over the last 4,000 years, maybe even longer, of people trying to convince others that mankind is not an animal. But we have been living under Aristotelian rule for centuries now. And that is the ailments of our world today. And the United States was one of the first big revolutions against the idea that mankind is an animal. That's actually why we fought a revolution. It wasn't just about taxes, wasn't even about overthrowing the oligarchy. It was about freeing the mind and freeing people from the mental slavery. And so with that context, that's why we're meeting today. That's why we have this class series as a reminder to people around the world of what principles compose our countries and what people need to know in order to make things better again and develop and build off of what came before us and continue to improve. And so today, I want to pass things off to my friend Robert Castle, our Super Deputy Campaign Manager, who will be giving us a class on Poe, which he has titled The Mind of Edgar Allan Poe, or How the American Revolution Continues in Principle. So go ahead, Robert.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, Jose. I'm going to need to pull this up. Maybe so. Can you pull up the slideshow? You can just, yeah, you can just go like that. So if you can go to the next slide. I want to begin by taking a quotation from the farewell address of George Washington, and the reason for that was just basically laid out by Jose. I think it's a self-evident thing that if a nation is crumbling to pieces, you might look to the beginning to try to understand how something could have resulted in such a way. And it actually happens that if you read George Washington's farewell address, it is an extremely thorough and precise document that kind of forecasts the potential ways that the intentionally constructed government could fail to continue to operate on the principles that it was created to operate on. And this quote in particular is relevant today, given the fact that our Congress just, or at least some considerable portion of our Congress, just cheered like a bunch of imbecilic, I don't even know what words to describe.
Seals.
Seals, yeah, seals. Cheered a warmonger who told about as many lies as he got standing ovations in the floor of our Congress, which I think is pretty much the surest sign that the country is, the soul of the country is actually fully disappearing from existence. So what George Washington says is, this is obviously this is about halfway through, that a nation which indulges towards another an habitual hatred or an habitual fondness is in some degree a slave. It is a slave to its animosity or to its affection, either of which is sufficient to lead it astray from its duty and its interest. And so whether you want to talk about the proxy war in Ukraine that is, a creation of NATO, or you want to talk about the genocidal policy of depopulation being carried out by the Zionist regime in Israel, in either case, and in other cases around the world, the United States' involvement in this travesty it's bound up with a disintegration of its own ability to govern itself, because all of the people that would otherwise be governing the affairs of our country are busy meddling in the affairs of other countries, taking payments from them, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm going to move on, and I'm going to try to actually get into the topic at hand, which is the mind of Edgar Allan Poe. And as a way to introduce that, I wanted to do a thought experiment, which is, you can go to the next slide. I want you to imagine that you're in a Dunkin' Donuts or some other, franchise of that nature. There's some music being pumped through the air. Maybe it's impossible to think. I often find that it's impossible to think when you're in one of these franchises. But I want you to imagine that suddenly the music cuts out, and then this instead was playing for you to hear. So hopefully this. Oh, you don't have the link? You don't have the link? I don't. Okay. I'm not sure how they're going to get it on the screen. Sorry?
Just hold on to the mic.
Yeah, I guess they'll just get it through the mic.
To use this feature, please make sure your app is running and can access the internet.
Do you have any way to get it, Jose?
Well, just text it. Spotify. Mic's right here.
It's just no. Yeah, that's.
Where's the mic?
Yeah, it's the phone, I believe.
Spoke, out of his mouth came fire and smoke. In the valley on my knees, ask my Lord, have mercy please. Every time I feel the Spirit moving in my heart, I will pray. Every time I feel the Spirit moving in my heart, I will pray. Jordan River, chilly and cold, chills the body but not the soul. All around me looks so fine, as my Lord, if all were mine. Every time I feel the Spirit moving in my heart, I will pray. Every time I feel the Spirit moving
Thank you, Mike. That's our electrician. Can you go to the next slide? So, obviously, the joke there is that what constitutes our culture as music is not something which ennobles the spirit or even allows the mind to function in a normal way. And when you actually hear American music that's founded in a folk tradition, it is quite ennobling. And it's just self-evident that is true. That's the nature of the beauty of that art. So my reason for starting with that kind of joke is because I do think that if I were to succeed in introducing the mind of Edgar Allan Poe in a class, it would have a similarly jarring effect as Roland Hayes being played in a Dunkin' Donuts, which is that it doesn't actually conform to anything that we expect to be American culture, American society, and that irony and that this perspective on Edgar Allan Poe that I'm trying to present to you is taken exclusively from the work of Allen Salisbury, who he is the historian concerning Edgar Allan Poe. He wrote very, very detailed analysis of the political battles that Edgar Allan Poe was involved in his lifetime, and Allen Salisbury actually continued to expose the slanders that were being run against Edgar Allan Poe well into the 20th century. Contemporaries of Salisbury were still publishing slanders against Edgar Allan Poe that were false in fact. And so part of what I'm trying to demonstrate is that what Salisbury discovered about Poe is something that Salisbury also it's a method of political intelligence, and it's something that Salisbury also demonstrates in the work that he did to uncover the true story not only of Poe but of the actual principles concerning economy that were involved in the founding of the U.S. So you can move to the next slide. I'm going to start actually with an extensive quote from the first chapter of Salisbury's book, which is The Civil War in the American System. That's this book, and this is published in 1979, I believe. And it's a 70-page essay, and then it's got about 300 pages of original documents, presumably just the ones that Salisbury considered to be most important. And in this book, he presents an extraordinary thesis, which if it doesn't provoke you, then you're not thinking. Because what he says is that there was never really a civil war in the United States. He contends that the war between the states that ravaged the country between 1861 and 1865 was the second military phase of the political battle which raged between Britain and the United States from the time a formal ceasefire was concluded at Yorktown in 1781. You can go to the next slide. There's a few slides like this, and this is basically his kind of synopsis in the beginning of the book. While it is widely acknowledged that the British oligarchy supported the Confederacy until its defeat appeared inevitable, modern historians have covered over the more fundamental relationship between the slavocracy and Great Britain. Britain, in its desire to replace the American system of industrial progress with the British system of Malthusian poverty and looting, created the Confederacy. It was British financial intervention exercised through such agents that subverted the implementation of a national development program as it had been put forward under George Washington and Alexander Hamilton. The resulting recreation of the slave cotton-growing South, then in alliance with certain New York and New England banking houses, served as an economic, political, and eventually military base for Britain's war against America. Okay, so now this is kind of the flip side of that. That is an account of the Civil War, and it identifies at least a network, if not individual actors, which he does go through. But there's the whole other portion of this story is about the American system. It's the Civil War and the American system. And what he realized was that the Cultural War that was fought between Britain and the United States in between the Revolutionary War and the Civil War was one of an attempt to suffocate a very specific group of economists in the United States who were adherents to the economic principles that were put forward by, as he said, by Alexander Hamilton, who was the first Secretary of the Treasury of the United States. So to defeat this game plan required the remobilization of the nation's workers, industrialists, and technology-proud farmers around the program that founded America. Henry Clay, John Quincy Adams, and Matthew Carey laid the groundwork, but the specific targeting of the treasonous British system and the organization of the political party that could rout it were left to economist Henry Carey and the Republican Party of Abraham Lincoln. The party of Lincoln succeeded in launching the United States as the greatest industrial power on earth, but the British were not brought to the ground. Through assassinations, divide and conquer tactics, and most importantly, the deceptive offer of an Anglo-American imperial alliance, which is what we are suffering under today, the British oligarchs reestablished an ever-tightening stranglehold over the U.S. economy and political system. Now, in 1979, before the British succeed in manipulating the United States into economic or thermonuclear debt, these policies must become a weapon for the reestablishment of the American system worldwide. Can you go to the next slide? I'm not sure what... Right, so this is basically a reiteration. This is how he ends the essay. And I'm just giving you the very beginning of the essay and the end, particularly to highlight what someone asked when they first came to the room. Well, I thought we were going to be talking about Jose's campaign, but we're talking about Edgar Allan Poe, and I'm curious to know what the connection is. And the connection is that what Salisbury knew in 1979 was that the legacy of Poe was a way to discover the fact that the United States, in fact, has been sort of pushed into a position where we are both threatened by and threatening the world with thermonuclear annihilation, and it's because we don't have control over our own economy. So he says, to the extent that British monetarists' control over the credit mechanisms of the country were allowed to remain intact, the war was not won. If the American system is not now restored, adherence to British economic policy threatens to plunge the nation and the world into thermonuclear disaster. So obviously, you would have to, you would need a more rigorous proof than what I'm giving right now to actually fully accept the thesis. But the basic point is borne out in fact that that the principles of economy that were laid forth by the first Treasury Secretary of the Treasury were embattled from the time that they were on the stage of history, and they were actually, the National Bank was progressively defunded, particularly by Andrew Jackson, and that is in the period leading up to the Civil War. So as far as I can tell, all of Allen Salisbury's conclusions are borne out rigorously by study of source documents. So that's the kind of context in which Allen Salisbury is thinking about Edgar Allan Poe. So if you can go to the next slide. So this is the essay that Salisbury wrote about Edgar Allan Poe, and if you can go to the next slide, there should be a So this is how he begins the essay. In Europe, it is often said that you can tell the spirit of a region by its wine. If that is true, then you most assuredly must be able to discern the true soul of a nation by the way in which it honors its poets. In Germany, the great poet Friedrich Schiller's memory and spirit are kept alive as a living tradition, albeit by a small and aging core of devoted followers. He lists several other countries. Italy has Dante, Greece has Plato, and these traditions, to a certain extent, have been kept alive, even though they're all, at that time, even much less than now, were being sort of progressively cleansed out of what could be called a popular culture. But he says here in America, which has for the last 200 years been the recipient of the benefits of the best minds of the rest of the world, the nation has allowed its only poet to be treated in such a despicable manner that one can argue the very soul of the country is disparted. This statement is not what some may wish to call hyperbole, others poetic license, still others metaphor. It is a simple statement of fact. And then he says, I do not hold you, the reader, responsible in this matter, for you have been lied to on the subject of poetry and art in general, and to the point that most of you would recoil. He gives a different example, but you could talk about the ceremony at the Olympics, where whatever is being put forward as the great triumph of art, this great accomplishment of humankind, is basically a kind of hedonistic worship of some ancient irrational deity, as in the case of Dionysus, as opposed to, perhaps something based on a universal principle of agapic love that would allow for society to actually advance the principles and the needs of all human beings, the general welfare. That's certainly not what was being represented by art at the Olympics there. But his point is that he says, to prove that you've been lied to on the topic of what art is, all you have to do is ask, what do you think of when you hear the name Edgar Allan Poe? And he says it a bunch of times throughout the essay, but basically he's kind of spooky, candles, there's a raven, 18th, 19th century something. He's crazy, he's a drug addict, he's a mystic, things of that nature, and that's sort of all we might happen to know of him based on what we were taught in school, even though he is taught in our schools, I think, probably somewhere still now. So part of the whole point of the essay is to establish very rigorously that Edgar Allan Poe was, his memory was slandered basically as soon as he died. And you can read that, you should read the whole essay, but there's a very bizarre fact, is that somehow his entire literary estate was put under the care of somebody who was an avowed political enemy. So it's and so when you look at some of the accounts that are given of Poe's life that come out shortly after his death, they are full of open fabrications. Letters that he never wrote are written and included in, lots of sort of twisting of certain facts, but mainly a kind of general coloration, which creates the sort of cultural image that we have now, that he's mystical, that he's just a writer of sort of mere stories. But actually, he invented the genre of the detective story as a way of sort of almost like, maybe you could say like a Trojan horse. I don't think exactly works, but as a way of convincing the general public to study something which it might not otherwise know about at all or have interest in, which is a very specific Neoplatonic outlook, which is in full accordance with the principles of the U.S. Constitution. So if you can go to the next slide. So this is just like one kind of schematic representation of the kinds of things that Salisbury points out in his essays. He's extremely thorough, and he has a way of uncovering a lot of details which are kind of surprising. But so basically, what he goes through in the Lost Soul of America is that, so we know that George Washington is the first president of the United States, and we know generally who Alexander Hamilton is. But there's this idea of a society of Cincinnatus. Cincinnatus, I don't know the full story, but he was a kind of Roman general who was involved in a military effort to stop stop some kind of rebellion, or I'm not exactly sure, but basically the reason why his name is significant is because he was a farmer before he took up a military political post, and then after the political situation was resolved, he returned to his simple life of farming, and so that is obviously associated with the name George Washington. But it's, some people know, I guess, there's a hereditary, there was a society, not a secret society, but a closed society of members of compatriots of the American Revolution, that it was patrilineally extended, essentially to defend the principles of the revolution. And it's very interesting that David Poe, who is Edgar Allan Poe's grandfather, was a member of the Society of Cincinnatus. And there's a lot of details that connect the continuing efforts to organize around the American Revolution to Edgar Allan Poe's life. And so the Marquis de Lafayette was a French Republican general. I'm not sure his exact designation militarily, but he was involved in the American Revolution. He came to fight with the Americans against the British from France, and then after the Revolutionary War concluded, he went back to France to try to organize a similar kind of conspiracy for the good. And he actually returns to the United States in an effort to get John Quincy Adams elected much later. And John Quincy Adams is another interesting character who, when you actually look at what he wrote and what he had to say, is very, very clearly understands himself to be attempting to continue to defend certain principles that were enshrined in the Revolutionary War from the general society, from what was happening in the Congress even as early as the 1830s. So Edgar Allan Poe, I don't have the exact date, but he attended West Point, and one of the interesting details West Point was the first military academy in the United States, and there was a lot of their teachers came out of a tradition of scientific thought that is connected to a long development of Republican humanism in Europe, and particularly connected to Leibniz. Leibniz was involved with the formation of the École Polytechnique in France, and this school was the sort of the basis of where it's, well, I don't want to talk about things that I don't know, but there's a clear connection between the École Polytechnique, which was an advanced scientific military academy, with the networks in the United States that were involved in the revolution. And so when Poe, he retires from West Point, I think because of epilepsy or something like that, and he petitioned to go on a trip to France, and he visited the École Polytechnique. When Marquis de Lafayette came to the United States, when he returned after the Revolutionary War had been concluded, and he returned, it's documented that he went and tried to visit David Poe, and that I believe he had passed away by the time he came back, but that Poe was among the guard that invited Lafayette to West Point. So there's a way in which all of this is happening in a real connected world that Allen Salisbury is able to reveal through historical study. Can you go to the next slide, please? I'm going to try to move this along. I know I'm kind of going on. But so this is the point to actually getting to what the content of what Poe actually wrote. A lot of what he wrote was a direct polemical attack against certain networks that had magazines in the United States, and that also had magazines in Europe. And the basic problem that Poe identifies in a lot of his writings is that there is a long tradition of certain ideas about what science was supposed to have been. And just to go back really quickly on that point, one of the things that Salisbury points out in the essay is that there's a famous character in Poe's stories, Charles Dupin, who's like he's like the Sherlock Holmes before Sherlock Holmes existed, because this Poe is the person who invented this genre. And what Salisbury points out is that there was somebody at the École Polytechnique whose name was Charles Dupin. And he feels confident to say that that is the namesake of the character, but he also points out that his understanding is that Charles Dupin is Poe's representation of not just himself, but of that whole network of scientific thought and that tradition. And that's kind of what I was trying to get at earlier by saying that he used these tales of ratiocination to preserve a certain tradition, so that he had a certain idea of what science was that was tied into not just, it wasn't just some academic exercise. These people were fighting wars. They were fighting literal wars and wars of ideas with publications and things like that. So what he takes up in a lot of his writings is the question of British empiricism. He identifies very specific people. He identifies Aristotle. He identifies Francis Bacon, who is famous for so-called inductive logic and a kind of empiricist concept of what science is. And he also wrote these kind of fantastical stories about what society was going to look like under these new scientific ideas. So I think the main theme of all of Poe's writings, when you look at them through the lens of Allen Salisbury's discovery, is this question of epistemology, and you can really see his writings come alive, where things that you might just think are dumb jokes or something like that are actually references to actual historical actors who had specific political agendas that he was attacking. He was actively attacking them in the same way that Salisbury attacks this guy H. Bruce Franklin, who wrote this long book about how Poe was a plagiarist, and I can go into that as well. But this idea of epistemology is how do we know what we know? Because if you think about the thesis of Salisbury's book, is that of his book on the Civil War and the American system, is that there was a financial intervention after the formal ceasefire, and that there was essentially a control of the United States through financial institutions. So if you ask the question, well, we all have money, we go through our daily lives, we're kind of forced to participate in whatever economy we live in. And for a lot of people, that currency can sort of take the quality of something that's given. It is money. But if you start asking yourself, well, what is money? What is money? Like I'm supposed to be using it all every day, or credit. I'm supposed to have a credit score, but what is credit? I think that these questions of economy really lead directly into the philosophical questions that Poe takes up throughout his writings, which is what I say there. So I want to use two examples from Poe's writings to acquaint you with it, and then I'll conclude and pass something along to if Kynan has something that he wants to add. So there's a story. It's called Melonta Tauta, which is Greek. I think it means like these things, things of the future or something like that. I think he translates it as like these things will soon come to pass or something. But it's a very weird story, because it says Melonta Tauta, and then it says on board On-board balloon Skylark, April 1st, 2848. And then so it's 1,000 years in the future. And it's this long weird story where someone is riding from a balloon to talk to one of his friends about whatever happens to be going through his mind, and he's talking about how great it is that, you know, these balloons fly around, but they're really slow. They only go 100 miles an hour. And it's kind of hard to tell exactly what Poe is trying to say for some of it, because it's not totally clear at all the time. But then at certain points he kind of breaks through this facade of like science fiction, and he's being very polemical and very clear about what he's saying. So there's this narrator, and he says, to be sure, our men of science, 2848, are not quite so bigoted as those of old. Oh, I have something so queer to tell you on this topic. Do you know that it is not more than 1,000 years ago since the metaphysicians consented to relieve the people of the singular fancy that there existed but two possible roads for the attainment of truth? Believe it if you can. It appears that long, long ago, in the night of time, there lived a Turkish philosopher, or Hindu possibly, called Aristotle. This person introduced, at all events, propagated what was termed, or at all events propagated what was termed the deductive, or a priori mode of investigation. He started with what he maintained to be axioms, or self-evident truths, and thence proceeded logically to results. His greatest disciples were one Euclid and one Kant. Well, Aristotle flourished supreme until the advent of one Hogg, surnamed the Ettrick Shepherd, who Salisbury points out is the editor of the Edinburgh Review. So he's making fun of Francis Bacon, who's a British empiricist philosopher, and he's making fun of the editor of the Edinburgh Review at the same time. One Hogg, surnamed the Ettrick Shepherd, who preached an entirely different system, which he called the a posteriori, or inductive. His plan referred altogether to sensation. He proceeded by observing, analyzing, and classifying facts, instantiae naturae, as they were effectively called, into general laws. Aristotle's mode, in a word, was based on noumena, Hogg's on phenomena. Well, so great was the admiration excited by this latter system that at its first introduction, Aristotle fell into disrepute, but finally he recovered ground and was permitted to divide the realm of truth with his more modern rival. The savants now maintained that the Aristotelian and Baconian roads were the sole possible avenues to knowledge. Baconian, you must know, was an adjective invented as an equivalent to Hoggian, and more euphonious and dignified. So he goes on like that. But I think, it could be maybe hard to appreciate why he would be so concerned about that until you look at what's happening today, and you look at what's happening with our culture, where it's what this idea of AI is it's all of this wrapped into one thing, because we're supposed to be asking the question, oh my God, can machines really think like human beings? But we're not supposed to acknowledge the fact that all of these computing systems operate on formal logic, whether it's a sophisticated kind of formal logic or not. It's all theorem lattices of formal logic, which have been convoluted into such a way where they can produce products which resemble idiomatic language, human language, but the idea that is implanted in us by that is that, oh my God, am I just a machine, or is the machine as a human? And it draws out this confusion between what a human being is and what a machine is. But there's another portion or passage where he's really clear on the question of the alternative. but the basic point is, he says, you know, the Aristotelians, that way to knowledge or truth is crawling like a baby, and you know, you go from one bit of logic to another. Yeah, it's in there as well. I'll just try to recall it and move on. But you know, formal logic is well, I can't remember which one is creeping, which one's crawling. I don't know if it really matters. But you know, in either case, formal logic, you know, you break down thought into these kind of noun constructions, like Jose was saying about nominalism in political discourse today. You break thought down into these kinds of mathematical, algebraic systems, and you say this is this, therefore this is this, and therefore, and it's so that's, I think that's why he calls it creeping, because he's this idea that our thoughts are supposed to kind of plod out bit by bit, like you know, the tiny steps of an infant or whatever. And he said, you know, the other one is crawling, but or the other, creeping and crawling. But his point is that the human spirit loves nothing more than to soar, is how he puts it. And he elaborates particularly in the last work, the work that he was writing, which was actually a lecture series that he was giving. This is when he was in the Bronx in the late 1840s. Eureka. He lays out pretty clearly his alternative to this kind of British empiricist epistemology, which his epistemology could be said to be an American epistemology, and it's this idea that he's following all of the leading developments of astronomers of the day. He's trying to get the most accurate, up-to-date picture of what is actually known through the telescopic observations that are being done. And he's fully involved in a kind of cultural battle against oligarchism and all of the forces which want to use the economy to impose a kind of serfdom on the common people. And he's definitely a proponent of progress, but his epistemology is that science is a fundamental, integral part of poetry, and vice versa. So the last work of his life, he says, actually, can I see it? He says, I want this to be judged only as a. So this is the preface to Eureka. To the few who love me and whom I love, to those who feel rather than think, to the dreamers and those who put their faith in dreams as in the only realities, I offer this book of truths, not in its character of truth teller, but for the beauty that abounds in its truth, constituting it true. To these I present the composition as an art product alone, let us say as a romance, or if I be not urging too lofty a claim, as a poem. What I here propound is true, therefore it cannot die. Or if by any means it be now trodden down so that it die, it will rise again to the life everlasting. Nevertheless, it is as a poem only that I wish this work to be judged after I'm dead. And in that regard in particular, and this is something which can only be taken up really at a later time, but he quotes Kepler, who in one of his astronomical books, he says, he's talking about how maybe his contemporaries might not understand his discoveries, because he was making groundbreaking discoveries into the composition of the solar system. And he says, well, if God waited X number of years, 100 years or 1,000 years, whatever, I can wait as many years for my writings to be read. So the point that Poe is borrowing from Kepler in Eureka is that his attachment to a principle of scientific progress and poetic composition has nothing to do with popular opinion whatsoever. Can we go to the next slide? So there are other examples, but I kind of went off a little bit, so I'm just going to try to conclude. So this is also from the farewell address, and the reason why I included this is because if you think about, I mean, if you look at what Washington says in the farewell address, it's not a list of things that you have to do. It's not, you do this, you do this, you do this, and then the government's going to run perfectly forever. The questions are being posed in a very straightforward, direct manner to every single person. The farewell address was published in a newspaper in Philadelphia and disseminated in the population. And in the same passage where he described what is now the slavery of the United States of America, and it can only be described as slavery to the extent that people in the United States of America are not capable or willing to change the circumstance in which we pay to cause genocide, we pay to incite civil wars, we pay to rob and steal the hundreds of countries around the world, and either we don't know what's happening, or we refuse to do something about it. And I think in either case, the prophecy or the forecast, or whatever you want to call it, the farewell address concerning slavery has in large part been borne out as an accurate one. But it's also an extremely optimistic document, and that's part of what I'm trying to say, is that he's asking the question: is the American Republic possible? Is it possible for this government to exist? And they don't give a positive or a negative answer, but they point out very clearly in the document that you have to foster peace and harmony with all nations in the world, and if you allow the regional conflicts and foreign influences and other sorts of bigotry to begin to control the decision-making process of the government, that the government will destroy itself. And he describes it as an experiment. And he says it's recommended by every sentiment which ennobles human nature, which I think goes back to what Jose was saying at the beginning, which is that it's obviously pretty easy to identify that the United States of America is going through a sort of crisis which it wouldn't be fair to expect to resolve well without some sort of transformative change, which would involve the intervention of actual human beings, human minds, not organizations, not it's not just going to magically happen. Individual human beings, the mind of individual human beings have to be engaged directly in formulating how it can change and changing it. And I think the reason why what's so fascinating to me about Salisbury is that he proves that the individual human mind is the driving force of history through his study of Poe. If you read his essay on Poe and you read his essay on the Civil War, like I said, either you're not thinking or you can't but be convinced that the human individual is the motive force of history. I will leave it at that. So we should. I went on. I didn't go. We had an idea of how to transition into a conversation, which I think we can still do, right? I don't know what people.
To you. Maybe we can see if anyone else has questions.
Yeah. I'm also not sure about questions from online. This is like an experimental format where we kept people waiting for 20 minutes at the beginning, and now
it says we had 740 people watching live, but I don't know how true that is.
Really? Are they still on?
44.
Well, are there questions that can come in?
That might be inflated.
They should write them, but Maybe
Yeah,
questions or comments here.
Yeah, so I read the Salisbury article, and I went to like a high school where I was really encouraged to read Ralph Waldo Emerson. So I noticed that like in this article and in this whole issue, like there's Salisbury takes aim at the transcendentalists and basically characterizes them as a sort of like a British / Italian outfit that's kind of trying to clandestinely subvert the American Republic, and Poe is an adversary of them. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that and just basic. I mean, because like we all know that like, well, I mean, it's sort of. I guess as a child, I basically thought that the British lost at Yorktown, and then they just decided, okay, we lost, so now we'll just go home and just move on with our lives. But of course, that's not what happened. And so the Society of the Cincinnatus is basically part of this, like what Salisbury calls ongoing political struggle that had multiple military engagements in 1812 and the Civil War. But I wonder if you could talk about that and sort of how, so like basically the abolitionists in the Northeast, the Transcendentalists, and the slaveocracy in the South were both kind of two sides of the same coin in a way. Is that how you would characterize them?
Well, I mean, I do have to say that I wouldn't pretend to have like a working mastery of all of the details in Salisbury's essay. Part of the reason why I put that chart trying to show, I mean, he explains the connection between Marquis de Lafayette, John Quincy Adams, James Fenimore Cooper, who's a novelist, Samuel Morse, who's a painter and inventor, Poe. He goes through a lot of different networks of this sort, and he explains how they're moving together at certain times in history, and so that the whole network of the Transcendentalists and stuff is another example, and it's I don't know if it's the thing that the secessionists and the abolitionists are like two sides of the same coin, or that like I imagine it has to be kind of like how, I mean, I have an understanding about, like, for example, Black Lives Matter. It's like I don't think that was just like some evil creation, right? It was there were actual things happening in the country that were causing people to have unrest and to try to seek political redress, and then there are these forces that come in and try to determine the course of that those movements. And I think that that's the basic picture that Salisbury lays out regarding the Transcendentalists, is that they're kind of tied to certain networks that are involved in that sort of political duplicity. So like Ralph Waldo Emerson and Thomas Carlyle were both brought into the network around Mill, John Stuart Mill. So like you're talking about like 6 different people who all have like literary output. Like I can't pretend like I actually know the content of those things, but the claim that he makes is that there's a connection between the salon that John Stuart Mill is making and Giuseppe Manzini, who is coordinating these young Europe networks, and that these are kind of I'm not sure exactly what the substance of that account is in terms of what those were supposed to have done. Maybe some other people in the room might know about.
Could I offer one thing from the article? There's a journal that Poe directly goes after I think in his How to Write a Blackwood article.
Yeah.
The Blackwood magazine is a British magazine founded in 1817, And there's this quote here that's not particularly vague from, I think, one of the founders of this magazine, someone named Neil, who says, "They're making prodigious efforts in America now for the promotion of native literature. Your magazine, I hope and believe, will become a sort of dictator. I wish it for many reasons, for your sake, and for my own, and for that of America. It will operate a reform there." So you're saying a British journal is going to operate a reform. This is in 1817. This is not terribly far removed from the war 5 years earlier.
Yeah. And it's like
burned down the Capitol.
When the British burned down the Capitol and tried to take back over. And so they're saying, so now, well, we've set up this magazine to try to prevent native literature or, literature in the country.
Right. And I think that, yeah, that's very helpful, and that's kind of, I think that is the significance of Salisbury's argument, is that if you take seriously the idea that there was, like, we talk about a culture war now, but if you take seriously the idea that from basically the late 1790s, the early 1800s, there were newspapers pumping out these kinds of subversive, anti-constitutional, whether or not they were trying to actively inculcate people to, like, revolt against the government, which they did do in the case of the abolitionist movement that Adrian brought up, but also just inoculating certain ideas which have nothing to do with the constitutional republic of the United States.
The Economist was also founded in the 1830s, specifically as a propaganda tract against protectionist laws called the Corn Laws, something like that. The Economist that we still have today. So it was founded to put out a message that was anti-protectionist in that time.
Right.
I think also when you started with George Washington, of course, Washington had one of the most extensive spy and intelligence networks imaginable, much of which is still being really dug up out in Long Island and various places, and that's what James Fenimore Cooper's The Spy novel is kind of a fictionalization of some of Washington's networks. But there is a tradition which is founded from that time of doing intelligence work to figure out what the enemy is doing on all different levels, including specifically how the British were operating to undermine the country going forward. And that's what Poe's grandfather is involved in, those networks, and that what Poe himself is. He's not just a writer, I mean, he's an intelligence expert, and that is sort of his deployment continuously, is figuring out what these operations were, particularly including emphatically culturally, how these operations were in fact working. And many of the pieces that he's writing, I keep thinking of this quote, which I think was from Lynn, but actually I think was from Lynn, where he said at one point regarding Linda LaRouche, regarding intelligence, where he said there are really no secrets, there's only blindness. So in other words, people don't really know where to look. And several of Poe's, and I really want to encourage people here, people watching on the internet or Twitter or whatever, to really read some of these stories and essays. And some of them are quite accessible. I think all of them are quite accessible. But for example, his famous detective Dupin, the murder of Marie Rouget is actually based on a real live murder that occurred, I think, in New York, and people were trying all over the world to figure out who committed this murder and how it was committed, and nobody could figure it out. And Poe actually, simply by reading newspaper clippings, actually figures out how the murder was done. So I'm not going to say more because it will spoil the story, but it's probably it's an hour read or maybe shorter, and it's well worth it. Or the Purloined Letter, where Dupin has there's a very important letter from an important personages which has been stolen from the house, and you have Scotland Yard going in, which is like the Sherlock Holmes character, you know, evidence, 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 and the Scotland Yard character is ripping up the floorboards and looking every place in the entire apartment, because it is believed that the letter is probably still on the premises. And what Dupin says is, well, one of the things, if you want to deal with beat your enemy, you have to know the mind of your enemy. And again, this is all very relevant for what we're dealing with now in terms of the country.
Can I
Yeah.
follow up with that?
You want to go? Go
Yeah. So
ahead.
there's this is from Salisbury's essay. He brings up the connection to Arthur Conan Doyle, and he quotes from A Study in Scarlet, which I think is probably like the most famous, at least it seems to me, one of the most famous Sherlock Holmes stories. So it's very funny because it gets right to the point of what you were just saying, and I think it might actually go to some of what you were thinking about bringing in, so this might be interesting. But he says, on this point, this is Salisbury, Edgar Allan Poe drove Arthur Conan Doyle into hysterical fits of defending the deductive method. For example, in his introduction to A Study in Scarlet, Doyle has Sherlock Holmes react the following way when Watson informs him that it is the Earth that revolves around the sun. So we're talking about the composition of the universe. Now that I do know it, I shall do my best to forget it. To forget it? You see, Holmes explained, I consider that a man's brain is like a little empty attic, and you have to stock it with such furniture as you choose. A fool takes in all the lumber of every sort that he comes across, so that the knowledge which he might be useful to him gets crowded out, or at best is jumbled up with a lot of other things, so that he has a difficulty in laying his hands upon it. Now, the skillful workman is very careful indeed as to what he takes into his brain attic. He will have nothing but the tools which may help him in doing his work, but of these he has a large assortment, and all in the most perfect order. It is a mistake to think that that little room has elastic walls and can distend to any extent. Depend upon it, there comes a time when for every addition of knowledge you forget something that you knew before. It is of the highest importance, therefore, not to have useless facts elbowing out the useful ones. But the solar system, I protested. What the deuce is it to me? He interrupted impatiently. You say that we go round the sun. If we went round the moon, it would not make a pennyworth of difference to me or to my work. So that's the great thinker Sherlock Holmes.
I wanted to just throw one other thing that people can look at in terms of Poe is the descent into the maelstrom, I think, is really key in looking at, because I won't go into the whole thing, but it's basically, a brother who's a fisherman. It's a fisherman and this brother that are out in a ship, and then all of a sudden this great whirlpool comes along, and it's destroying the ship. And in this particular story, you get to what Poe conceived of as a reason in terms of, and in contrast to empiricism or deductive logic, because the brother is, absolutely scared. He hangs on to the ship in order to survive the whirlpool, but the protagonist, he doesn't do that. Instead, he sees a little barrel that's in the whirlpool itself that's swirling around, and he makes this, leap of faith, and he jumps and he holds on to the barrel, and he actually survives. And and of course that's a counterintuitive thing, because why would you actually take that leap, go into this whirlpool? But that's how he actually survives. And I mean, that's, I think, the great thing about Poe himself, is that his stories are constantly full of attacking this notion of empiricism, of sense perception, and what really is true creative thought. And I mean, this relates to what we'll hopefully be starting next week in terms of this series with Vladimir Vernadsky, who he was a scientist of Russian, Ukrainian origin, and his great discovery was that he had discovered 3 different phase spaces in the universe. The abiotic, which is non-living, the biosphere, which consists of life, and the noosphere, and this term noesis, which is a Greek term for mind. And towards the end of his life, Vernadsky had written a paper on some thoughts about the noosphere, in which he said this was going to be the domain that was actually going to dominate the planet, because it was the first time in which human scientific thought was really revolutionizing the world. So I think we'll be picking this up, but I think it totally relates to what you were talking about in terms of the science of reason, as Poe explained it.
Yeah, and it's worth mentioning also that this class was, with all of its warts, as Jose said, is conceived of as an introduction to a class series on LaRouche's economics, which is kind of provocative idea on multiple levels, probably for some people, and I just want to say, is there any way we can put a link to the people that are watching? Is there a way we can get a link out to the people that are watching right now? Because I think it would be, well, but like a clickable link?
Yeah, sure.
I was just thinking we could link to the conversation that happened with between Bill Jones and Dennis Speed on the LaRouche.
Oh, you mean the TLO fireside chat?
Yes, yeah. I'm not sure if that's allowed.
You can encourage people to go find it.
Well, okay. Yeah, I would encourage people to look on Rumble for the LaRouche organization channel, and to go to the most recent episode on the titled the fireside chat. It's titled "The Science of Peace," and there's a very good explanation there of the 50-year the legacy of Lyndon LaRouche over the past 50 years, and how the principles of physical economy that he was advocating for and agitating for and discovering have actually been borne out in the actual real strategic situation that the world is in right now. And there's a very long and fascinating explanation there of the connection between Vernadsky's thought and LaRouche's economics by a guy named Bill Jones. And so I definitely recommend checking that out. And also just bear in mind that if all goes according to plan, we're going to have a class a week from today, starting an introduction on LaRouche's economics.
Okay, I'll close this out. I'll close out the stream. I would just like to take a minute to promote EIR.news. If you're wondering what the hell's going on every day, don't worry. You get an email with a daily alert. It only takes 20 to 25 minutes, 35 minutes if you're a slow reader. And the link is right here. I guess for you it's down there. EIR.news/happy summer. You get 1 week for free, and then it's just $10 a month. It's like 30 cents a day. It's nothing. It's nothing to be updated as to what's actually going on. It's where I get my news. It's how I stay up to date and informed, and it's how I know how to act against nuclear war. So, EIR.news/happy summer. I am not paid to promote that. I just really like the news service. So, we don't have a timer, so I'm just gonna hit end.